Hello, welcome back to the Murakami Companion podcast, a show inspired by the works of Haruki Murakami, where we analyze his body of work in its entirety. Today we'll be talking about Novelist as a Vocation, another non-fiction book which was published in Japan in 2015 and in English in 2022, 7 years later. That's a long gap. Obviously, there will be no real spoilers. I'm gonna start with a theory that might be a little bit crazy. In 2020, first person singular was released in Japanese, and then in 2021 in English. I think Novelist as a Vocation, being released in English in 2022, makes sense because it's like the sequel, the counterpart of first person singular. You see, in many of his books, Murakami makes a point about how we have like a real self in the real world and a shadow self in the, let's call it imaginary world, spiritual world, dream world, metaphysical world. I think First Person Singular, it's the autobiography of Murakami's shadow self, and Novelist as a Vocation is the autobiography of his real self. Because that's what it is straight up an autobiography with some really good advice about writing here and there. It tells the story about how life was before his first novel, how the idea of becoming a writer came to him, his first writing competition, his second novel, writing in his kitchen table while having a day job, the people around him at the time, etc. The writing advice is pretty good advice, but I think for the most enthusiastic fans of his work, this book has two very cool things going on. First is the motivation. He remarks often that he's just a regular guy who works at the bar and loved baseball, and he's very humble, and you might even think he has a little bit of an imposter syndrome. And he's like, you don't have to be any sort of extraordinary human being just to write a good novel. Just go for it. Give it a try. You know, there was people who didn't believe he could make it as a writer at first, which is insane. So whenever you're faced with criticism that isn't constructive, ignore it and keep moving forward. Go do your thing. And the other big takeaway from this book is that you see what his life was at that moment, and you start to put together where some of his ideas came from. And then you might realize that there's more ideas around you that you might notice. Like, he worked at a bar. His first novel is about two friends who often meet in a bar. The second novel is about pinball machines, one of which is at the bar. He has written many novels that talk about the history of Japan in the 20th centuries, about libraries, about jazz, about many things that are not out of the ordinary at all. My personal favorite short story of his is about a young couple going to rob the bread out of a McDonald's. To write that, you don't need to be researching places you've never been in. You don't need to have an insane knowledge of professions that aren't yours. Just take what you know and try to do the best you can with it. And, you know, maybe try giving it a little unexpected twist. I recommend this book if you are either an aspiring writer or a fan of Murakami who has some level of interest in his personal journey. Let me say it again, this is mostly an autobiography, and specifically an autobiography of his professional life. It's obviously had very good advice for writers, but this is his story. Of a short episode today. You can get Novelist as a Vocation pretty much anywhere where good books are sold. If you want to support this podcast or you just like t-shirts or coffee mugs or our prints, we got a few digital stores where you can find all of that and more, featuring the cover artwork for this episode, inspired by Novelist as a Vocation. There will be one design for each episode release of this podcast.